Bloodborne, the spiritual successor to Dark Souls, except that they're still making Dark Souls games. Now, you may be wondering, why am I bringing up a game that came out almost a year ago? Well, over the winter break, I was listening to a lot of Game of the Year podcasts, and Bloodborne inevitably came up, as it should, but it was not always positive. A lot of people talked about how they actually found the game disappointing compared to the previous Souls games. Now, for me, I loved Bloodborne. I actually think it's maybe my favorite of those games, although I haven't played them all, so, it's kind of hard to say. Still, I wanted to know, what is it about Bloodborne that some Souls fans find so disappointing? So I decided to replay the game and kind of think more critically about it, and I actually did kind of come up with some really good reasons for why I think people maybe don't like Bloodborne as much. What I've come to the conclusion to is that I actually think Bloodborne does lack some of the replayability and variety that the previous Dark Souls games had, and also, at times, gets a little too grindy and repetitive for its own good. A lot of this actually comes from the change in health system that Bloodborne has. In Dark Souls, you're given Estus flasks, and whenever you go out and from a bonfire, you have typically 5 Estus flasks, and then when you die, you start back over with those Estus flasks, but you can't get any more, so it kind of encourages you to play the run smart and take your time and be careful, because you only have a limited number of these resources, but at the same time, you don't have to worry about grinding and finding more. Bloodborne actually goes back to the way it was in Demon Souls by making their health items, blood vials, consumables. They'll drop from enemies or corpses, and you can hold up to 20 at a time. Fortunately, any spare blood vials you pick up do go into your chest in the Hunter's Dream, and when you die, if you have less than 20 blood vials, the game automatically moves those blood vials stocked up in your chest back into your inventory, which is actually really nice, because it does save you the trouble of running around dealing with item management. So I think I get why the developers chose to go with this system. Bumping the number from 5 to 20 does make sense, because you do lose health a lot quicker in Bloodborne, and in general, Bloodborne is a more offensive game in the way the combat works, as opposed to the more defensive style that Dark Souls is, so they don't want to punish you too much by giving you too few blood vials. And honestly, finding more blood vials isn't that big of a deal for the most part when playing the game. Where it becomes a serious problem, though, is during the boss battles. If you're butting your head against a boss, you can run out of blood vials really quickly. And then you get into that loop where you're just running back and forth to the boss, and then you're avoiding all the enemies on the way, so you're probably not picking up any more blood vials, and even if you did, you're probably only getting like 1 or 2, which you'll lose very quickly in a boss depending how that's going, and then you start to see where the problem lies. So the only real solution to this is you have to pick an area and grind it for blood vials, or grind it for blood echoes to then head to the Hunter's Dream to buy blood vials, and you just end up seeing the same area and enemies over and over again, and it starts to get really repetitive, and I don't think this is what the developers intended, but it's kind of what you have to deal with. Now let's talk about Bloodborne's environments, because I love the way Bloodborne looks. The Victorian Gothic feel is exactly up my alley, and I love the sort of classic elements of werewolves, pitchfork mobs, and then eventually it takes that really creepy Lovecraftian turn that for me personally, speaks to me on a lot of levels. Now, I definitely think there are some Dark Souls fans that for them, they just simply like Dark Souls aesthetic more, kind of like the medieval fantasy, swords and shields, dragons, and really, I mean, that just comes down to personal taste. But I will say that Bloodborne's locations do feel a little bit more limited than Dark Souls, which can be a problem. What I mean by this is I think Bloodborne has a really consistent aesthetic to its environments and architecture. Just everything has that same feel, but in a way that feels realistic. Dark Souls, on the other hand, likes to mix it up. Compare Anor Londo to Undeadburg. They look completely different. Dark Souls kind of takes the Mario approach to its environments by just throwing in a little bit of everything and somehow actually making it fit pretty coherently, which is quite impressive. And I think for a lot of players, they were very used to sort of the consistent new looks and environments that Dark Souls gave, so when Bloodborne came in and kind of has this consistent look and aesthetic, it isn't quite as fresh and interesting when you're expecting sort of these sweeping changes in locations. Now, Bloodborne, it does have a variety of colors, but it has this very muted color palette that kind of overlays the entire thing. It's clearly intentional, and it does fit the tone of the game wonderfully, but I think after a while some players probably started to feel a little oppressed by the game the way it looked after a while. I'm sure this is in some ways what the developers wanted, but it's also important to balance that or you're gonna lose your audience. They probably could have thrown in a little bit more color and warmth just to keep your spirits up. Now, I think ultimately the biggest deviation between Dark Souls and Bloodborne is in the combat. Bloodborne is just faster paced, and in a lot of ways stripped down. The speed of everything is increased, there's no shields in the game. Yes, the old Hunters DLC did add that one, but come on, the game is designed around not really needing one. There's more emphasis put on dodging enemies and stunning with the guns. As I mentioned earlier, it's because Dark Souls combat was very defensive based, and they decided to take it with Bloodborne and turn it into a more offensive game. You can gain back health from attacking enemies if you're quick enough. I think that shows that the developers didn't want you hiding behind a shield, but constantly on the attack. So again, this kind of comes down to which do you prefer. I think there are some people who really like that defensive, kind of reactive style of combat that Dark Souls presents, so for them, Bloodborne isn't quite as appealing because it is different. But I think From Software knew this, which is why they called the game Bloodborne and didn't put the word Souls in it at all. Now, I do take issue with the way Bloodborne handles its weapons. Let me explain. Compared to Dark Souls, which has a plethora of weapons, Bloodborne only has 26, which I'm okay with. I actually really like that. The issue that comes in is that for these weapons to stay viable in later parts of the game, you need to upgrade them. The materials to do this are very rare and costly, meaning you can't upgrade everything without some serious grinding. When the game first came out, you could only get one blood rock per playthrough, which is the material needed to max a weapon. Now, the Old Hunters DLC did add a second blood rock, and there is a recent patch that does make it possible to buy them, although that will cost you a lot of insight, which again requires a ton of grinding. So it is a little bit better than when the game first launched, but you still need to really think carefully about what weapon you want to focus on. This is actually the developers really hurting the player, because by the time you find some of the really interesting late game weapons, you're already so far in upgrading the weapon you're already using, and spending the time grinding is such a horrible slog, you end up not giving those weapons an honest try. I think a lot of players ended up sticking with the weapons they started the game with. I know I did. Which I think is a real shame. For this video, I started a second playthrough, and I picked a different build, and I've been playing with different weapons, and I'm really loving them, and I'm sitting here kind of regretting that I only stuck with the same weapon the first time I played the game. So to wrap this all up, when taking another look at it, I do see a lot of the flaws that Bloodborne has, and honestly, I do think Dark Souls does some things better. But at the same time, I also really like a lot of the things that Bloodborne does differently, and I think for me, that just comes down to personal preference. I kind of like the style that Bloodborne's going for over Dark Souls, and I really hope they do fix some of the legitimate problems with the game if they ever make a Bloodborne 2, and then it can really be the game that Bloodborne is meant to be.